guest speaker, and I'll try and pronounce your name properly on camera. It's Bas Dijkstra, and he is the Director of International Academy and Inspired Testing. So what is Inspired Testing? So it's a global software testing company based in South Africa and the UK, and provides testing consultancy and coaching services. They have 15 plus years of experience across multiple testing disciplines, including automated testing, functional testing, exploratory testing, and performance testing. And the nature of today's webinar, Bas will show you how you can use SpecFlow together with a variety of tools to create efficient, reliable acceptance tests. And he will also discuss the importance of specifications that are independent of the implementation, as well as show us some tips and tricks on how to achieve said independence. So just first, a couple of few things to talk about the session. So as always, please use the Q&A tool for questions. They get swallowed up in the chat often enough, so please use them there, and also upvote them if you'd like them answered. We have a dedicated Q&A session at the end. So with time in mind, hopefully we'll have a good amount of time to go through them. If not, failing that, we'll still answer them. We can take an extract from Zoom and answer them after the fact, and we'll then send them out in a follow-up email. And also all attendees will receive a recording of the webinar with all the links that we share in this webinar. So you'll have them to use as and when you choose to. So with that, then I'll invite you, Bas, to take over the screen share. And we can begin.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction and a pretty good pronunciation of my name. Well done. All that practice wasn't for nothing.
Don't tell him that.
Oh, well done. First time right even. Awesome.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you all so much for joining me today. I saw one question during your introduction, Jordan, popping up in the chat already about whether or not this webinar was being recorded, and it is. So but
yeah, we'll share it. We'll share it with everyone after the webinar is finished, probably in the next couple of days.
Perfect. Yeah, as Jordan already told me, my name is Bas Dijkstra. I am the Director of Academy at Inspired Testing. So I quite recently joined them on September 1st. And what I do at Inspired is I take care of creating and delivering training opportunities for both our own employees, and we're about 300 people, mostly in South Africa, when a couple of them in the UK. As well as for increasingly global client base. As Jordan already told you today, we are going to talk about SpecFlow, about how to use SpecFlow, about different kinds of tools that you can use together with SpecFlow, and as you wrote, the importance of creating specifications that are independent of the implementation of the application. So yeah, let's get to it. I'm not going to tell you too much about SpecFlow itself, unless there's anything in specific you want me to mention before we get started, Jordan. I am going to... Anything? Good?
No, feel free. Yep, sure.
Good. So I take it you all know what SpecFlow is, what SpecFlow does, what SpecFlow does not do. If not, Jordan's there for all of your questions around SpecFlow itself. So I'll happily leave that to him. What I'm going to show you today is a couple of good practices around writing executable specifications, and show you different ways to turn those specifications into actual automated acceptance tests with different kinds of tools, talking to different kinds of interfaces of an application. So the way this webinar came to life really was in a discussion between Jordan and Katarina and Matthias of the SpecFlow team and myself about the way SpecFlow is typically used, and what I definitely see in practice when working with clients. And I'm happy to say that the people at SpecFlow shared this view is a lot of the automation behind the SpecFlow specifications, and even the way these specifications are written, they are very often directed towards the graphical user interface of an application. And that's, on the one hand, that is entirely understandable, because that's the interface of an application that's mostly customer facing, and the behavior is often written from a customer, from an end user perspective. And unfortunately, still in the testing and the automation world, that is really all people know. So especially a lot of people who've been in testing a while and then make their first steps, take their first steps, the first steps on their automation journey, they've been so, from their testing experience, they are so used to using graphical user interfaces to interact with applications that's the approach that they take in their automation efforts as well. And that's entirely understandable. The only problem is that graphical user interface driven automation is the hardest type of automation there is to write. It's the slowest to execute. It requires often the most maintenance, but it's the hardest form of automation there is to write. In this webinar, I'll show you a couple of different kinds of approaches for automation. Of course, we need an application to work with that. And for those of you who've seen previous talks, I use this application quite a lot. I tend to introduce it as the world's least safe online bank. So please don't deposit any money into the accounts you see here on screen. It's actually it's a demo testing application. It has a graphical user interface, a web-based graphical user interface, which you see on screen right now. But it also has both a SOAP and a REST API. It has a database. It has it's an open source application, so you can find all the source code for the application to play around with on GitHub as well. So, and that makes it a perfect candidate for these kinds of demos and talks and webinars and stuff like that. Just to quickly show you why never to actually be a customer for this website, I can just go to the admin page here and say, well, just reinitialize the database. I hope the bank that you actually use does not support operations like this. So what we're going to cover is the scenario where an existing customer of this bank wants to open a new bank account, a new checking or a new savings account. So after they've logged in, again, it's really only username and password, so it's not really all that safe. What they do is they navigate to the open new account screen. There they have two different drop downs. The first is what type of account do you want to open, either a checking or a savings account. And this process requires you to deposit money from an account you already have, so from an existing account into that new bank account to activate that account. So that's why you also need to choose an existing one of your existing bank account numbers, and this customer already has like 11 of them to select. And then after you select this, if all goes well, it confirms that you've successfully opened a new account. You get a new account number, in this case 13566. And if you go to your accounts overview, you should see that this account number is now included in your list of accounts. Let's have a look at some code before we dive into the actual automation of this scenario. As Jordan already said, well, there are some tips and tricks I would like to share. First, the importance of writing specifications that are independent of the actual implementation or the actual interface that you are going to use in the automation, in the verification of this behavior. So what you see on screen here is just an example of the type of specification, the type of behavior that I see a lot with clients and in trainings and in other types of sessions. So I've got John, who's a registered Parabank client. So far, so good. And it states John is on the Parabank homepage. When they log in using their credentials, they navigate to some kind of page, they fill in a form, then they see a success message on the screen, and they see the newly opened account on the accounts overview screen. So this is the type of scenario that I see a lot in people using SpecFlow or other tools that support BDD. There are a couple of problems with this type of scenario. So it looks like sort of kind of readable English. I agree there, but it is, first of all, this is something I often see where people don't really do BDD, but come up with scenarios while they're automating tests or while they're writing their tests. And there's a lot of focus on a specific interface here. And in this case, it's the graphical user interface. So you see a lot of reference to pages, to screens, to an actual form, to a navigation from one page to a different page. The problem here is that at the moment I am, or in our team, we are coming up with the specifications. I don't want to really think about how we are going to implement and how we're going to automate it. I'm only concerned about what is the behavior that my application or a specific feature of my application needs to exert, needs to show. I don't want to deal with the details of how I'm exactly going to verify that behavior. I just want to know what the behavior is, because that is going to be my executable specification. That is going to be my living documentation in the end. I don't want to have all these kinds of details that I may not even know, that I may not even be aware of upfront in my specifications. I want specifications that are independent of the actual implementation details and independent of the actual interface that I'm going to use to interact with my application and verify the behavior. Why? Because at the moment, at the time we are writing these specifications, we don't know yet, we often don't know exactly yet how we are going to implement that and what other design decisions that need to be made. And also as a consumer, as a reader of these executable specifications, I'm not interested in screens, in buttons, in database queries, API endpoints, anything, and something simple. I just want to know how does my application behave? What's the behavior that's? So it's a good idea to separate that from, to separate the implementation details of your scenarios from the behavior that you're describing in these feature files, in these scenarios. So what I typically, the shortest way for me to explain this, focus on the what your application is going to do and try to avoid references as to how your application is going to do that in your scenarios. So this is one of the, this is just an example. I've got another one here that focuses on the API level. It does something similar. So it actually also creates a new account by posting the necessary details to a specific endpoint. They check on the status code to see if that operation was completed successfully. The newly generated account number can be found in the response, which is then assuming I'm going to store that somewhere because I need to check on that in a different step. And then I can get the list of accounts for that specific customer at another endpoint, and finally check that the new account number that I just created using that HTTP post is in the list of their accounts as well. So this is actually this is the same functionality. So I want to create a new account, and then I want to retrieve my list of accounts with this bank, and I want to see that my newly created account is included in that list of accounts. Two entirely different ways, both of them not really easy to read and not really easy to maintain, to understand, both focusing and mostly because both are focusing very much on a specific interface. There are a lot of implementation details on there. For the API ones, well, I see specific endpoints here, HTTP verbs, HTTP status codes, another endpoint here. So at these two scenarios, these two examples, they're describing the same behavior, but because there are a lot of implementation details about a specific interface that we're using here, that makes them really clunky and hard to read, and with a lot of detail that I think should not be in there. Instead, I would like to show you another example, and that's the example that we're going to use in the remainder of this webinar, which is describing the exact same behavior, but what I've left out is all of the implementation details, is all of the details, all of the specifics related to an interface. So there's no reference to elements on a graphical user interface here. There's no reference to any elements of an API here. And what this gives you is the freedom in SpecFlow when actually, first of all, this is much easier to read and to talk about with between your three amigos, your developers, your testers, and your business people. Second of all, this leaves a lot of freedom for the person who is going to turn these specifications into automated acceptance tests. And I don't really care who does that. It can be the developer, it can be the tester, it can be the business person, it can be the janitor. Whoever it feels like they're up for the job, or whoever has some extra time on their hands. I don't really care. I'm not saying this should be just the tester's job. It's the team. It's a job for the team, really. But it leaves a lot of freedom to choose the most efficient way to verify this behavior. And that's what I want to show you in the remainder of this webinar, how you can automate this, how you can turn this specification, again, completely stripped of any implementation details, but still hopefully pretty clearly describing what it is I want to verify and what the expected behavior of my online banking application is, with different kinds of tools, using different kinds of interfaces of my online banking application. The first example that I want to show you is doing this through the graphical user interface. So that is, again, that's an interface that's typically used a lot in creating automated acceptance tests from these specifications. I've chosen to use Selenium. That's just one of the tools that can do this. But when we have a look at the code that's underneath these specifications, I'm pretty sure it looks pretty familiar to those of you who've worked with Selenium before. So let's take a look at this code here. So I've created all of my step definitions, all of my code implementing the steps you saw in this, let's close this one, in this feature, is in a single binding class account creation UI step. So all of the steps implementing this scenario are in this step definition file. So we create an instance of, I've got a customer object here, which I can use to store data, to store some state about the customer that I'm using for this specific scenario. So it's John Smith, and he has a username and a password and a specific ID. I create a driver, obviously, because I'm using Selenium, I'm creating a driver object. And in this case, I'm using the Chrome browser. I've got an implementation for my given step that starts my application, logs in using the credentials corresponding to my user, and then navigates to that open new account screen. For those who had a little bit more familiar, I'm using the page object pattern here. So all of the details concerning the implementation of a specific page are one level at the page object level. So for the accounts overview page, I really only have a single method that checks if an account with a specific account number is listed. And for the login page, for example, I've identified the elements on the page that I need to interact with for this specific scenario. So I've got a text field for the username, text field for the password, and a button to actually try and log a user into the application. And I've got a method that exposes the actions that I want to perform on a specific page. And in this case, for a login page, logging in is an action that I typically want to perform on that page. So I've written a method for that to do that, and where I can specify a username, a password, and this method will take care of actually filling in those values into the right text fields and then clicking on the login button. So for those of you familiar with Selenium and page objects, and in this case C#, this is pretty straightforward. For those of you not so familiar, all of the code that I'm showing, this is probably a good time to mention that all of the code that I'm showing in this webinar for the different kinds of interfaces is available on GitHub. So the people at SpecFlow have been kind enough to host my code on their GitHub repository. So if you go to, and of course, the tab I'm using or that I want to use is exactly behind. There we go. So this one. So if you go to SpecFlow OSS and then examples, and you go to the webinars and you select today's webinar, you'll find all of the code that I'm showing in this webinar on there as well. So if you want to have another look at the code or at the features or anything, it's all in there. I've got similar steps for the when and the then. So I'm opening a new account, and that can be either a checking or a savings account. So there's another page object that takes care of that. And then all we need to do is, once we've successfully opened a new account through the graphical user interface, we need to go to our accounts overview page and then check that accounts overview page, on that accounts overview page, the newly created account that we've created in this when step is part of our list of accounts. So this is what you typically see a lot with SpecFlow. When people see the people responsible for writing the automation behind these specifications, they turn to a tool like Selenium, for example, and create automation by Selenium written against the graphical user interface of the application that we are testing and that we're developing and that we want to release to our customers. So if we run these tests, you'll see that it compiles the code, it starts the browser, it logs in, creates an account, and it goes by a little bit. Please, you could trust me when I say, well, it actually checks that it's checking the right thing. But I'm happy to show you that. Let's say this is a string. If I say, well, this is an account number that it's definitely not going to generate. Let's do it 6 times 9 to really make sure that we don't. Just to show you that it's really testing what it's supposed to test. So don't just trust me when I run some code, and I want to show you that it's actually testing. And now it's going to check on this page that there's an account number 6 times 9, which is not there. So it will make this test pass, but this is just to show you that it actually checks what it's supposed to check. So this test fails because there is, it expected this to be true, meaning it expected this account to be listed, which it was not. And that was exactly my point, because it should check for this new account number and not some random account number that's never going to end up on the screen. So again, this is what I see often in automation that's behind these SpecFlow scenarios. But what I said when I introduced this application has many more interfaces. And that's typically true for a lot of the applications that we work with. It's not just a graphical user interface that we can use as testers, as developers, as automation engineers. Again, this user interface driven automation, it's often the hardest type of automation there is to write. And often it's the slowest to execute. It requires the most maintenance. And that's why it's a good idea to make your scenarios, your specifications independent of specific interfaces, because that gives you the freedom to choose the interface that's most effective, the easiest to write your automation against, the most effective in actually verifying the behavior that you're describing in these scenarios. Again, I've used Selenium here. I tried to also implement the exact same test in Playwright, which is the Microsoft automation library that's really gaining a lot of popularity these days. But I failed. And the reason I failed to do that is because this project is on .NET 6, which is the newest version of .NET, and the Playwright installer does not yet support .NET 6. So that's a known issue with Playwright at the moment. Otherwise, I would have been more than happy to show you how this also works with Playwright. I can do something similar with Playwright, what I did with Selenium. So I can, it's just another tool to write automation against a graphical user interface for web-based applications. So where I chose to use Selenium here, I could have just as well chosen Playwright. I think, and Jordan, correct me if I'm wrong here, but recently there was another video or an article published on the SpecFlow website that actually showed you how to how to use Playwright in combination with SpecFlow?
Yeah, we did a webinar, so we created a plugin for it, just to make people's lives easier with consuming it. We did a webinar. It's on our YouTube channel, so I'll paste that in the chat as well if people want to see.
So yeah, again, I could have just as easily. I wanted to. I intended to also show you how to do this with Playwright for this exact same scenario. The only problem was Playwright and .NET 6 do not really play nicely together yet, or at least not on my machine at the time I wrote it. But because this specification that we're automating here is independent of the interface that we're using, and the application allows me to open new accounts and verify and retrieve the list of accounts for a specific consumer also through an API. That means we can also verify this behavior entirely at the API level, and don't need thereby completely ignoring, avoiding, whatever you want to call it, the graphical user interface, because this behavior is also visible in at the API level. So to demonstrate that, I've created a different set of steps, and the reason I'm changing the tag here is because well, call it cheating. I call it effectively using the features of SpecFlow. I've used tags to point to specific classes of step definitions. So what I've done here is by changing the tag of my scenario to API, for those of you not familiar with this, I can scope bindings, so step definition classes in SpecFlow to a specific tag. So where these steps, which I showed you just before, are only visible to scenarios where with a tag equal to UI, these steps are visible only and used only in scenarios or entire feature files tagged with the API tag. So that allows me to quickly switch between different classes containing step definitions. So this API step definition class, again, it's meant to verify the exact same behavior, but now using the application's REST API instead of using the graphical user interface. The scenario itself, again, because it's independent of the interface that we're using, remains the same. So there's no change in the scenario, which also means that if at some point during the development, during the lifespan of your application, a more efficient interface comes along that you want to use for the automation, for the verification of the behavior of that's specified in your scenarios. If you write your scenarios independent of the implementation details of the interface that you're going to use, you don't need to rewrite your scenarios. All you need to do is change the underlying step definition code. So what your customers, your business people, the rest of your team sees in your reports are these exact same scenarios, the exact same living documentation. The only thing that changed is how that behavior is verified under the hood. So that's another good reason to really keep these implementation details and these references to specific interfaces out of your feature files, out of your scenarios. The tool I typically use for working with REST APIs in C# is a library called REST-Sharp. You may have heard of it. You may have not heard of it. This is a claim made by themselves. probably the most popular REST API client for client library for .NET. I have no way to check whether or not that's a true claim or whether that's true. But I like it because it abstracts away a lot of the boilerplate code, a lot of the details that I need to deal with when I want to communicate with the REST API in my C# code. I could have also done this just by using system.net.http, the built-in .NET libraries and classes that allow you to communicate over HTTP from your code. REST Sharp is just an abstraction layer on top of that, which makes your code a little bit easier to write and a little bit easier to read, at least from my perspective. So what I'm doing here is creating a new request, which is a post request, because I'm sending the details or the data for creating a new account to the API, to my Powerbank application. The way that the API is structured is you pass in the necessary details using query parameters. It doesn't take checking or savings. It takes 0 or 1, where a 0 is equal to a checking account and a 1 is equal to a savings account. So that's just the difference between selecting checking and savings from a dropdown in the graphical user interface compared to specifying checking or savings when you create that same account using your REST API. I then execute the request and deserialize the response, the JSON response, into an object of type account, which I created myself. So the response contains the new account ID, the ID of the customer to which this account belongs, the balance of the account, and the type of the account type that's associated. So this is, again, either checking or savings. And what I'm then interested in is when I retrieve the list of accounts corresponding to this user, similar, again, exactly the same as what I did through the graphical user interface in when I used Selenium, is I want to make a request here, a GET request in this case. In this case, the endpoint I need to use is from customers, and from that specific customer with the customer ID that's corresponding to the customer that I'm working with in this scenario, my customer John, who has a customer ID of 12212. I want to get his accounts, and all I want to verify is that that new account number that was created in this previous step, that was returned by the API when I created that new account through this post operation, is that new account number in the list of accounts returned by this endpoint, by this operation. So let me quickly check if I didn't make any mistakes here. Nope, just warnings. You can forget warnings. So when I run my tests again, you see there are no, even though my scenario is the same, there are no browsers anymore, because I'm verifying the same behavior, not through the graphical user interface, but using the REST API of my application. That doesn't mean that that's always the better solution, because there will be a lot of situations where the only way to verify the behavior is through the graphical user interface. The thing that I want to show, the thing that I want to stress here is, even if you leave those details out of, so you don't prime your scenarios, you don't write your scenarios in a way that there's only one interface that you could use, and you have options. You have the freedom to choose the most suitable interface for checking, for verifying the behavior written in that scenario. So we've dealt with the graphical user interface. We've dealt with a REST API. So we've used Selenium. I tried to use Playwright. Didn't work, but it should once that .NET 6 compatibility thing is fixed on the Playwright side. We've used REST to verify this behavior at the API level. Often you also want to check, check something directly in a database. Let's say, for example, in this scenario, creating a new account directly in a database, probably not a good idea, because there's probably a lot of triggers and a lot of procedures that kick off when you create a new account. But this last step, so verifying whether or not that account is successfully associated with the customer and shows up in the list of accounts associated with that customer, in a lot of situations, checking that directly in the database might also be a good idea. So we've checked this in the graphical user interface. We've checked this using the bank's REST API. Another option might be to check this using a database. So directly in a database. That's also something you can do for your scenarios driven by SpecFlow. So again, there's no direct reference to a user interface or an API or a database in there, which means I'm free to use the interface that suits my situation the best. To give you an example of how that could work, I also created, and let me change the tag to database here, is I created the database steps. There's a lot of duplication in here because the given and the when steps are exactly the same as for the API steps. So if I'd practiced clean code a little better, I would probably optimize that. But for the benefit of this webinar, I thought it would be easier to just change the tag and then point to an entirely new class of step definition. So you'll have to forgive me for taking a little bit of a shortcut there and do some copying and pasting. But if we look at the then step, this one is actually different from the previous one because it's the then step that we want. So the verification, so is that new account associated with the customer? I want to check that in a database. A quick spoiler alert. I'm not actually talking to the real Parabank database here. Why? Because this application is written in Java and it uses HSQLDB as its database platform. And that's pretty much impossible to, or at least not unless you jump through a lot of different hoops. It's really almost impossible to connect to from a programming language other than Java. So that's why I chose to use a different database. So I'm using SQLite here, which is probably the most lightweight database platform that I know, because a database is just a file on a file system. So that the entire database is in this project as well. This is not the actual database that's connected to this application. Again, it's just a different type of database, but again, that's not really the point. The point is I want to show you how to connect to a database from your SpecFlow steps. And to be able to do that, I chose a database. So there's a database with really just one table, an account table with some data in there. And I want to check that a specific account number. So also I don't use this account number here because it's dynamically generated and I don't insert anything. I just retrieve data from a database. So instead, I'm just checking is account number 12345 in there. I chose SQLite for this. That's just a database platform. You could do something very similar for an Oracle database or a SQL Server database or a MySQL database. The only reason, again, I'm not talking to the actual Parabank database is because it's HSQLDB, which just doesn't play nice with C#. So I had to choose an alternative, and the most lightweight alternative was SQLite. So that's why I chose SQLite here. And that also allows me to distribute the database together with the code for you to use on your own machine. And so what I'm doing here is I'm creating a database connection to, in this case, just a file on the file system, because that's my entire database. I open the connection. So this code would be exactly the same for any other database platform. It's only the way you make the connection that differs from one database server, one database platform to the next, really. And there might be some slight variations in the SQL syntax, but yeah, that's a little bit beyond the scope of this webinar, really. So I'm doing my SQL query. I'm just saying, well, give me the number of accounts where the ID of the account is equal to, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But would this be a realistic test where I could actually connect to my Parabank database? I would have used this newly generated account number there. And I checked that this returns a result set. And I want to extract the number of rows from that result set and then check that the number of rows, so the number of accounts that have that specific account number, is equal to 1. So let me quickly save this. And if I run, go away, my test again. And now, again, creating a new account through the API, but then checking in the database at the database level if the account is really there. Now, this one passed. A quick one, the quickest way to show you that it fails is filling out, again, a different account number. And I'm not sure if that actually saved the change. It didn't. I have to manually save it because the demo effect. There you go. So it expected one result from a database query, or a result equal to 1, but it was 0 instead, meaning that there's no account with ID 5 times 9 in my account table, which is exactly what I expected. And again, I've made no changes at all to the scenario, yet I've verified behavior now through the graphical user interface, through the REST API interface, and using an actual database, even if it wasn't the actual Parabank database. The final interface that I want to show you, which admittedly is not something I've seen too often in practice, but in preparing this webinar, chatting with the SpecFlow team, they said, well, there are definitely teams that do this, is talking directly against your source code. So using SpecFlow to specify behavior that's then verified using unit tests. So that's the final interface. So again, because the actual source code of Parabank is in Java and not C#, I created something of my own. I've created some logic in, especially here in the customer, which is a create new account method that just adds an account number to a list, to this list of accounts. Again, there's no changes at all to the feature. That's exactly the same. The behavior is exactly the same. The only thing I'm doing now is checking that using yet another interface, which is not the graphical user interface, not the REST API, not a database, but the actual source code. That's yet another interface that you can use to verify that behavior. So not this one, boss, this one. So what I've done here is create yet another step definition file, tag that and scope that to the unit tag. And what you see here if you look at the step definition code, it really only makes references to the code here. So there are no external interfaces. So no API, no graphical user interface here. It directly talks to the code, which means it's really only the code that's being running, not the application that's running on my machine somewhere. And this is also something you can do with Spec. So with SpecFlow, you can even specify the behavior that's being verified at the unit test level. And so just to demonstrate that this works as well, I've now tagged my feature using unit, which means it should execute the unit test, which it does. And now it did this one test passes, and it uses these steps, which are basically just unit tests, because these are test methods that directly interact with the source code of the application. So that's yet another interface that you can use with your SpecFlow scenarios. And just to show you that this can fail too, what I've done here is basically I just check that I create a new account with account ID 12345. So there's nothing automatically generated by the Parabank application anymore, by my banking application. This is what I put in. So I create a new account 12345, and I check that that account is present in the list of accounts that's associated with this customer, just now at a code level, at a unit testing level. So let's say instead of 12345, I'm checking 12346 again. Save before you run your test again, just to make sure that it can actually fail. It now says, well, I expected one account in the list with an account ID equal to this, but it was 0, which is perfectly understandable because that's not the account number that I added. It's a different account number. So yeah, again, that's yet another interface that you can drive through your SpecFlow scenarios. And again, there's if you once you write your features, your scenarios, once you document your behavior in a way that's independent of the actual interface of the way that you want to verify that behavior. So if you focus on what is the behavior and leave the how is that behavior implemented out of your feature files, there's a whole range of options that you can explore, a whole range of different types of tools that you can explore with SpecFlow. So the SpecFlow layer stays, that remains unchanged, but what happens under the hood, it can be, again, a graphical user interface using Selenium, using Playwright. It can be a REST API using REST Sharp or just system.net.http. You can directly connect to a database from your code and retrieve data or insert data if that's something you'd like to do in that step definition, or you can just talk to the source code of your application, all without having to update these scenarios. And as an added benefit, I think leaving the implementation details out also makes your scenarios a lot more business readable, a lot more readable by humans, really. That's it for what I wanted to show. Just under an hour, slightly longer than I expected beforehand, but I hope it has been interesting. I hope it has been a clear example of what we try to do, show you some different types of tools that you can use together with SpecFlow, and how you can, and what the benefits are of leaving these implementation details, these references to specific interfaces out of your scenarios. Jordan, are there any, I see there are some questions in the Q&A.
There are.
And quite a few things in the chat as well.
So the chat, I think there isn't any questions. I was monitoring the chat and I was just replying to people that were asking for links and things like that. So I think the chat is fine. The chat is question free, but the Q&A does have 7 questions. So we can go from the top. I can just read them out and then you can answer them.
Let me then, I'll just leave my screen open to share any sites or code or whatever I need in answering the questions. So please do.
Sure, cool. Let's get started then. So an anonymous attendee posted, what are the possibilities while running the UI tests using SpecFlow parallelly using MS Test, and how to handle backend data concurrently?
Ooh. That is a very good question. That's not something I do have a ready-made answer for. So,
So
I don't know off the top of my head how well MS Test supports parallel test execution.
And neither do I, because I've never done it with MS Tests. So that makes 2 of us.
I know NUnit does it quite well. I really don't. I'd have to look that up really. It is. You need to be very careful, especially with UIs and running different driver instances at the same time, and potentially manipulating the same data in different tests. But that doesn't even touch whether or not the underlying unit testing framework is supporting it, and to what extent. So.
It looks like someone in the chat, Ronald, has said that MS Test does support parallel testing. So whoever asked that question, I guess maybe go and have a look at the MS Test docs to see how you can implement the parallelization.
Awesome.
Cool. And there was, I think maybe in terms of the handling the backend data concurrently, maybe there was some concern for making calls to databases or something concurrently, but I don't think that should be a problem, right?
No, as long as you keep the data separated. So what you don't want to do is inject data or manipulate data in a specific test and then rely on that data being manipulated or not being manipulated in a different test. Because when you run your tests in parallel, you never know in what order these different transactions are going to take place, and if they're even finished. So that's a problem when you run tests sequentially, but even more so, it explodes when you start running tests in parallel.
Yeah, and I think anyone that runs tests that rely on one another in terms of data need to slap on the wrist.
Yeah, dogmatically, I totally agree. Pragmatically, sometimes there is just no other way than to do this, because otherwise creating new and different users or anything that it's not always 100% entirely avoidable, but definitely try and avoid it as much as you can to because if you are not going to run into problems when you run your tests sequentially, you will run into problems when you're going to run them in parallel.
Yeah, I've definitely seen cases where this kind of thing can be a problem. So yeah.
So do I. But just one thing that I want to avoid is it's sometimes really hard to avoid. But definitely, by all means, always try and avoid it wherever you can, because it will make your life easier if you keep your tests and the data that they consume and that they require independent of one another.
Definitely. Cool, good. So next question from Ronald. Why a named user is chosen? Why not simply use a user? So I think where you've put user John, I think he's saying why not just put a user?
I find, and this is a bit of a debate sometimes in the BDD and the Gherkin world. I think it makes my scenarios, my specifications a little bit more vibrant, a little bit more lively. It's also a lot of people are working with a lot of teams tend to work with personas where they know they attach a name and a photo and maybe other kinds of data to specific kinds of users of an application, for example. So they know that when you see John referenced in a scenario, people know because they've used those personas. Well, that's a regular user who's been using who's been a client with the bank for 10 years now, so they know really well how so that a lot of tacit knowledge about the user is embedded in a persona. So that's why that's why these specific names are often used. I like to do it because I think it reads more. I think it reads better, but then you get into the area of personal preference sometimes to some extent. So that's my reason. That's my main reason in this case, because I don't have any personas. I just know, well, there are two users baked into this demo application, and the user I'm using is actually, his first name is John. So why not use that in my scenario as well? But it is to some extent a matter of personal preference.
Cool. Thanks, Bas. So the next question is how to pass a random value from a feature file instead of hard coding the values in the feature file. So I think you could use.
Yeah.
We have an external data plugin that you can use for working with things like Excel and CSV. But I guess
I'm not a big fan of that, to be honest, because I see people do that. Extract specific data from feature files and then load it into some other type of external database or data source like Excel or CSV. The problem is then you have to keep track of two different types of data source. I'd rather just have them in my scenarios instead. And if it's too much, then just put them in the code and not in yet another external data source.
Yeah, I was going to suggest the same.
Getting back to the question, random. So this example, it has to some extent a random value because I don't know what the account number is going to be that's generated by the application. I don't care in this case. I don't care what the specific value is. I just I want to know that a value is generated and that value then shows up in the list of accounts when I retrieve a list of accounts for that specific user. If I wanted to check some properties of that random number that was generated, I do that in a different scenario because that's a different part of the behavior. So, and maybe I want to check that the account number that's being generated, it has 5 digits and the first digit should be between 1 and 9 and the other 4 digits should be between 0 and 9. I could write that in a different scenario because that's behavior that I also am interested in. For this specific scenario that I'm showing on screen here, the actual properties of the account number, of what the account number looks like, that's not important for this specific scenario. It's maybe important for another scenario, but then I hope something like that comes up in your discovery sessions, in your example mapping sessions, for example, your specification by example sessions. Well, how about, is that important? Yes, well, in that case, we need to give some examples and we need to write scenarios that accurately document that behavior and then automate them. But for this specific scenario, that's not a relevant fact.
Cool. Someone in the comments also mentioned another tool called Auto Fixture. I've seen some of that, but I'm not entirely convinced about it. But yeah.
What is that one? No. So now I'm curious.
So far as I've seen, it can randomly generate data. So if you've got, say a username or something or an email address, it can randomly generate those.
So it's similar to I know the Faker library in Java and Java.
Yes.
So it's something similar probably. Yeah.
Yes.
That can be helpful sometimes, but I'm not too fond of that, combining that with my executable specifications. I want my executable to be as concrete and as tangible as possible, and random values and auto-generating random values under the hood don't really align with that in my experience.
Cool, thanks very much. The next one is, since you've used tags for switching the interfaces, can there be more than one interface in the tags? So I guess they've seen your example where you've scoped them, and the answer is no. Because if you have, say, for example, the unit tag and another tag, like that's scoped, like an API one, then you'll get a ambiguous binding message when you try and execute that test.
Yeah. So what you get here, and this is where the SpecFlow plugin for Visual Studio really helps, is it's now going to say ambiguous steps. So which means is that once I run this code, SpecFlow does not know how to add. It doesn't know which of these two step definition methods to execute because they both match the same step in my scenario. So there's more than one step definition associated with this step in my scenario. What I can do, of course, is access and tie different steps in my scenario to different interfaces. And that's what I've effectively done in the database ones, where the given and the when were run using the given doesn't really do anything with an interface. It just sets up some data, but the when operates on the REST API interface, but the then operates on the database layer. So that's perfectly possible. So you can mix these interfaces up within a feature. So because it really depends on an individual step, which of the interfaces is most efficient to complete that, to set a state or to perform an action or to do some kind of verification.
Cool, good. So the next question is, how do you handle exceptions and errors, particularly in the implementation of the test? I'm not sure that you'd want to.
It depends. So sorry, I've been a consultant for too long. I think that's you learn to say it depends a lot. If any of the operations, for example, in my given step, yield some kind of exception, I think you're totally right. I don't really want to handle it because there's no point in continuing the execution of the when and the then step because I have no idea in what state my code or my application is in, because something, an exception is nothing more than something unexpected happened. And I don't really know how to handle it. In some cases, you might want to handle an exception, say, well, because your application is maybe a little slow, or you need to just retry inserting some, maybe well, sometimes the first time I call an endpoint, it fails, and trying again often helps, and then you maybe want to capture it because that's not the point of that specific scenario. It should definitely be addressed in some other kind of test or scenario, but if it's not the subject of this specific scenario test, I could imagine some situations where just handling an exception, just for example, trying something again, because that's something that sometimes happens in the environment we're working with. Yeah, but it's not a practice I'd recommend. I'd recommend using a lot. Again, there are always situations where, so again, dogmatically, I'd say never do it. Pragmatically, I say, well, sometimes it might be the quickest way around some things, but then at least make sure that the root cause is addressed and verified, tested somewhere else.
So the only example I can think of is where if you've got like a complex web UI that uses a lot of fancy JavaScript and things loading and stuff like this, then you may encounter like element clicked intercepted in Selenium. So sometimes it can be useful to swallow exceptions like this if you're like retrying clicks and things.
So what I've done in this specific example, so these page objects, they all extend a base page. And I'm doing something similar here. So basically, this is just using a WebDriver wait, which sort of kind of does something for you. It waits until an element is in a specific state before you interact with it.
Yeah.
So, and as I said, this is just error handling really. So I don't want to expose the WebDriver timeout exception. Instead, I want to fail my test. So I'm using assert.fail with a custom message. So that's another application where because this looks better in the reporting than a WebDriver timeout exception, which nobody understands except the people who wrote this code. So that's another. But that's on a much more low. That all has to do with synchronization. And again, this is something that typically happens with user interface, and it's exactly this kind of thing that makes me say, well, this is the hardest kind of automation there is, especially because of these JavaScript, these JavaScript heavily, very rich client-side web interfaces that are all the rage these days. I grew up with annoying. Yeah, I grew up with static HTML and before HTML, so I don't know but people want it, and it looks good. It looks good. It just another way to what I often say is these graphical user interfaces are interfaces written for human beings. And that's what makes it really hard to automate it with the machine. And because that's one of the problems. A graphical user interface is made for human beings. An API or a database or a queuing mechanism or a batch, that's an interface written for machines. So it's often almost always much easier to write automation against interfaces that are written for machines to consume instead of against a user interface, being the graphical user interface, that's written for a human being.
Cool, thank you. So there's one from Richard. If the scenario was tagged with all three tags, how would the test behave when run? So I think we've already answered this.
Just showing you again.
And then he extends that question and says, if it doesn't run all three implementations, is there a dry way to do that?
Sorry, could you repeat that again?
Yeah, sure. So if it doesn't run all three implementations, which we know it doesn't because we get this ambiguous step, is there a way basically to do it without repeating the feature?
Oh, absolutely. So I'm just going to show you what happens when you because I'm using the Spec Flow plugin for Visual Studio, it already warns me that there are ambiguous steps here. But when the code still compiles and I can still run it, but it will throw binding exceptions and ambiguous step definitions. Basically what my IDE already warns me, but if you use a different IDE, maybe you will not get this warning or a different type of warning, but when actually running it will also. So I included some duplication in the code because that makes it easier it says unit twice. That's why, and not say UI, then it actually gives me 3 of them. That's what I was looking for. Typically it's, and I don't know if there's any tool or command line tool other than what's being given to me by the SpecFlow plugin that can help me check for ambiguous step definitions before I run my tests. Jordan?
So only in the IDE, it would tell you inside of Visual Studio and presumably in Rider.
So in Rider or in Visual Studio or maybe in VS Code as well. I don't know, but that depends more. That's more a feature of the plugin than of SpecFlow itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's a warning given to you by the IDE. The compiler will still accept it, but then throw an exception at runtime.
Yeah.
What we've just seen here. But my best advice is just don't do this. So I just make sure that there's always exactly one step definition for each step. I've done some duplication here because I wanted to run the same feature using different interfaces. In practice, you wouldn't do that. You would pick one, which is the most efficient for that specific step or for that specific scenario or for that specific feature. And as long as you make sure that your steps are not overly generic, which is an anti-pattern as well. And there should be exactly one interface that's the best fit for the implementation of a specific step. So you'd never run into this problem.
Cool, thank you. The next one is, how do you execute it for each tag? Do you need to repeat scenarios for each tag? I guess we've just sort of covered this.
Yeah, again, this is really just to show you how to work with SpecFlow using different tools against different interfaces. In practice, I would not run all 4. I would not run this scenario using the graphical user interface and the REST API and the database and against the code. First of all, that's probably not something that it's basically verifying the same behavior 4 different times. And once is enough. It's really about picking the best interface for you. I'm definitely not recommending you to implement it in 4 different ways and then run through all of these using different tags. My point of the thing I want, the message I want to get across here is there are different ways of doing this. And for me, the quickest way to switch from one interface to the next was using these tags. But that's not something, if I do this with a client, they'd probably run me out the building really quickly. And they'd be really very right to do so, because it's more about picking the right interface to implement and not running the same scenario against different interfaces.
Cool. Thank you very much, Bas. So in the interest of time, we've obviously got a couple of other slides to go through. So anyone that didn't have their questions answered, we'll take an extract of the questions. We will answer them.
It's funny thing is, when we answer these questions, the number of questions in the Q&A went up instead of down. I don't know what that says about my question answering abilities.
No, it's normal. It usually happens. But yeah, we'll answer the questions, and in the follow-up email, we'll put answers to them as well. So
yeah, sure. I'm happy to take some extra time to address all the other questions. So that's really the least I can do.
Cool, thank you. There you go. You heard it from Bas directly. So if he doesn't do that, you can find him and do what you will. So cool. So moving on then. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this course from Inspired Testing. So if you follow the link that I will post in the chat, you can read more about this course. But I'll give you a little overview. So the course will give you a holistic view of BDD and the phases that make up BDD, and the supporting practices, techniques, and tools that can be used to implement BDD effectively. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Bas, you'll be hosting this. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, cool. So
absolutely,
if you enjoyed Bas today, then please take a look at this course, and you'll get to the pleasure of listening to Bas again. As I said, I'll provide this link and we'll share this in the email going forward as well. So for everyone's information, we recently added, it coincided with the launch of .NET 6 and Visual Studio 2022, but we added some project examples of how you can automate different types of applications. Again, I'll paste this in the chat and we'll share it again. But if you have a specific use case that you'd like to see an example of, feel free to go to our repository and check those out, and then you can run them locally. They should all just work out of the box, providing you've got, for UI, for example, you'll need Selenium and that good stuff. So moving on to the Community Heroes program. So if you decide to make a contribution to SpecFlow in some way, whether that's some sort of video mentioning us, or maybe you advocate for SpecFlow, or you make a contribution into the open source code, then you can submit that entry as a community hero submission, and you'll basically get a $25 Amazon voucher on us. So don't let your contributions go missed or unheard. And that's all. So I will just pop these links in the chat before I forget. And I think that's it from us today. So hopefully everyone's enjoyed the webinar, and thank you, Bas, for your time today. It's been very, very, very interesting to see what you've demonstrated today. So go and follow Bas on LinkedIn. I've pasted his LinkedIn handle in the chat. And again, thanks, Bas, and hopefully everyone enjoyed it.
Yeah, from my end as well. Thank you, Jordan, for hosting this. Thank you for having me. And yeah, thanks to everybody who took time out of their day to attend this webinar as well. I really enjoy doing it.
Cool. Hopefully we'll do it again soon.
Yeah, let's do that.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.